Jim Jordan is the latest Republican politician thinking he is above the law. His launch of an investigation into the Manhattan DA prosecuting Donald Trump may not be just an abuse of his power and may be illegal under New York law. I'm Dina Sayegh, and let's get into this. Now let's launch right into what the New York law says. I'm going to read it to you. It says that under the law, a person is guilty of obstructing governmental administration in the second degree when that person intentionally prevents or attempts to prevent a public servant from performing an official function by means of intimidation, physical force, or interference. So the governmental administration here is the criminal prosecution of Donald Trump. The public servant here is DA Bragg. And the intimidation and interference is his investigation and issuing subpoenas to the office in order to essentially intimidate and interfere with the prosecution of Donald Trump. Now, Jim Jordan isn't even trying to hide that's what he's doing. He's saying he needs to get to the bottom of this prosecution. He needs to make sure this doesn't happen again. And he has been put on notice by the DA's office that he may be committing a crime. Now, I'm going to read to you what they said to him specifically. It says, the House GOP continues to attempt to undermine an active investigation, an ongoing New York criminal case with an unprecedented campaign of harassment and intimidation. Repeated efforts to weaken state and local law enforcement actions are an abuse of power and will not deter us from our duty to uphold the law. So he's just been put on notice. Now, it's ironic that he's even issuing these subpoenas, considering he defied a subpoena when it was issued against him. Despite criminally defying a subpoena, now that he holds the power to issue one, he's doing it in this way. Now, it would be one thing if the prosecution of Donald Trump were in federal court. Congress has authority to oversee the Department of Justice and investigate the Department of Justice. It is a federal agency. But this is a state court, and he's running smack into the 10th Amendment, actually. The 10th Amendment says that there's a balance of powers between the federal and state, and that if the Constitution, if it hasn't been enumerated, the powers given to the federal government, then those are reserved for the state. So Congress doesn't have the authority, it hasn't been given the authority to oversee state courts, certainly not a state criminal court. If there were a legislative body that had authority to oversee the DA's authority, it would be the New York legislative body. They could, if they thought the DA was overstepping his authority, they could look into it. But that's not what's happening. This is Congress. This is federal. It has no jurisdiction. It has no rights over what any state court does. We do have the separation of powers between the federal government and the state government. And not only that, but once you start getting into the justice system, there's a lot more rules. Like even in a civil suit, a lawyer can't threaten criminal, administrative action in a civil suit to gain a benefit. That's a huge no. And yet here, Jim Jordan thinks he can threaten a congressional investigation and have no repercussions. There is such a thing as not being above the law. Just because you have an idea doesn't mean you have a legal right to do something. So here we have Jim Jordan getting to know the limits of his power, that as a congressperson who already defied his own subpoena, he doesn't have the right to interfere with the public administration. This is now a state criminal court action. And Alvin Bragg is a public servant, and he doesn't have the right, Jim Jordan doesn't have the legal right to interfere with that indictment, with that prosecution. He doesn't have authority. He's a congressperson. He's not a state legislator. This is not his body. It is not a federal prosecution. He doesn't have the right. So will Jim Jordan, now that he's been put on notice, stop his illegal interference with the prosecution, or will he continue to act as that he is above the law, just as DeSantis does, just as Trump himself does? Jim Jordan himself seems oblivious to the separation of federal and state government. His own quote as to why he's launching this investigation is very revealing. He says the New York County District Attorney's unprecedented prosecutorial conduct requires oversight to inform the consideration of potential legislative reforms that would, if enacted, insulate current and former presidents from such politically motivated state and local prosecutions. So he basically wants to create some sort of federal law that would limit state or local prosecutions. I mean, he can't. That's the whole point of the separation of federal and state. And it shows how far he's willing to go in support of Donald Trump.
Hey, Meidas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram @MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.